Aye.
Aye.
Okay, motion passes unanimously. Thank you. Okay, Celeste had sent out the previous meeting. The past minutes, the previous meeting. Okay, we have a first. Is there a second for the past meeting?
Jim, your audio is kind of tough, but I'm going to second it anyway.
Let me try to get closer up there where the computer is. Maybe that's the problem. Can you hear me better now?
Much better, yeah.
Okay, good. Yeah, there's just three of us here, so there's no reason I can't get closer. Okay. Is there any additions or deletions to the past minutes? Any adjustments that someone would like to make? Okay, hearing no additions or deletions, all those in favor of approving the past minutes? Aye?
Aye.
Okay. Is there any opposed to approving the minutes from the last meeting? No? Okay. Thank you. The motion passes unanimously. Okay, as a reminder, we'll move to old business. We went over risk, wildfire risk models in the last meeting. So Celeste sent out the kind of the work plan, and so we can step down through that. Is there anybody that is? Please chime in as we kind of work our way down through that. But again, these are just the topics that we'll work on. We have why models are needed to measure wildfire risk, the types of models. So we have ordinal and cardinal, and then we have deterministic and probabilistic models. Is everybody still good with that? Yeah, okay. We're going to have a section that discusses the limitations of models, and then model evolution. Am I getting ahead of you, Celeste, here?
Yes, a little bit. What section are you in, Jim?
And we're going down to section 4.
Yeah, and there we got into a lot of oh, sorry, Nancy here. We got into a lot of detail last meeting about these 2 points, and I'm sorry I didn't do a good job of putting my of putting notes into the draft in time for Celeste to circulate them. But there was a lot of discussion about examples of successful use of models, and we spelled out some examples, which I got good notes on. The vision for California wildfire, how a model could answer certain questions. We talked about model validation, as well as model evolution, uses being like decision support, sensitivity testing, cost benefit analysis, prioritization of communication, and then the limitations, balancing different factors, considerations not captured, expertise. So all of that would be encompassed in all this. If you guys remember, we had a pretty long discussion about that. And so it's my fault for not putting it all into this version of the outline, but I've still got it, and we were going to take the first cut at drafting anyway. And so just wanted to make sure everybody knew that all that discussion will still be in there.
Okay, nope, that sounds great. Thank you. Anybody else have anything around that conversation they want to add? Then we have a topic on hazard maps that we've discussed that quite in depth, and we had a presentation from Dave Sapsis. That would be something we discuss. And I don't know, we have wildfire risk models used by other jurisdictions. Anybody know or aware of that, at least in California? I know, the insurance companies, but I'm really not aware of risk specifically. I know there's many jurisdictions have a hazard map, but I am not personally aware of anybody doing specific risk modeling that's an agency or a local jurisdiction, unless somebody on here is. I don't know, Nancy, have you aware of any? But I don't know.
I was assuming this meant things like Australia, a completely different kind of jurisdiction. But
you gotta have some bases, right? But I don't know of any in California.
right. Well, I think the Energy and Infrastructure agency or office, they have their own risk models. It's possible that that we could list those kinds of models as well, how they're different models for different purposes. So I think with that, like anyone who wants to nominate a model for putting it on the list, we agreed not to go into a lot of depth or try to not to be exhaustive, but to be more illustrative. And so we were gonna look at what we could find from kind of high level search. But if anyone else on the group is interested in contributing to the list, that would be super helpful.
Yeah, I was just going to say, this is from Energy Safety. We don't have our own models. We are involved with the utilities building theirs. So
Gotcha.
Yeah, but I think it's like the fact that the office is reviewing risk models that are being built by the utilities is kind of interesting and important. Would you agree?
of course.
Right, because that's what you do. And it looks like Max had an idea.
Yeah, I guess, and maybe it's just part of our lit review somehow, but I know there's the Forest Service has a wildfire hazard potential map, and they have some ancillary data that they've kind of packaged up. I'll put the link in the chat. And many of you have probably already seen this, but this is one source. The other that again, it's mostly for lit review, but I ran across a paper recently that has a really good review section in it of a bunch of international kind of risk rating approaches, which I hadn't seen before. This paper has some interesting findings. This paper the second link I just put in the chat, but they've also got a really nice review section and a table in it where they review all different kinds of risk kind of rating approaches in different countries and including Australia. So anyway, I don't know how much depth we eventually go into any of this, but at least from the lit review side, this is I think pretty helpful.
I think that would be really helpful, but I can't see anything in the chat. So did you already hit enter?
I did. Let's see.
I see it there, Nancy, and I'll make sure that it gets in the notes and it will go out as well.
Weird, because I can see somebody's chat, but I can't see Max's. Yeah, if you put it in the notes, Celeste, that'll keep it on the list. But yeah, I think those would be great.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you.
Right. Anybody else with a hand up, Celeste? No? Okay. Very good. Again, I think kind of what Max was just talking about, that the literature review where we have wildfire risk research models. from academia, industry. So I think that kind of fits in there too, don't you, Nancy? Yeah, I think it's good.
Sure.
Okay. Okay, does anybody have any additions that or comments they'd like to make around the wildfire risk models section?
Jim, if I just ask a question, I've been looking at and I think we previously struggled with this a little bit about how the CPUC maps integrate both with hazard severity zones and the work of this group. I just read through their webpage again, and it's interesting. They use fire threat primarily, or wildfire threat, but then in a couple of occasions they mention risk. And I just wonder, from members of this group who may have more experience with the CPUC's work, about how, especially with that, and maybe it was inadvertent, but the inclusion of the word risk there in at least a couple of places where they describe what they're doing, how that nests within both our efforts and FRAPS, because I do think that's going to become a very interesting line of discussion about the intersection of what we're doing, of what the CPUC has done, and what the FRAP maps do as well in the hazard space.
Yes, you know.
I can offer a little bit. The expert who would know more, I can ask to find out more information. But you know, it's meant. Well, first of all, they're fairly static. You know, so that's the limitation of them. But I mean, I guess with threat, I mean, it's just that there's the you know how the consequence of a fire happening there. That's how you end up with the tier 2 and tier 3 designations. I think that's maybe different than risk because you're not taking into account. I mean, probably. I guess. You know what? I'm going to stop.
Okay. I know Dave Saps has worked on this quite a bit, and he's not here today.
Yeah, and Coco Tomasi is who I would ask.
Yeah. So, no, good point, Dave. We can get a look at that again.
Yeah, just if I may, just because this was, and I certainly don't want to put anyone on the spot because this caused me to pause as well. But under the CPUC fire threat map, it says in 2012 we created a statewide map designed specifically to show areas where there's an increased risk for utility-associated wildfires. And then it went on to talk about then everywhere thereafter they refer to threat, with the title of the map being threat. And so maybe it was inadvertent, the inclusion of that, but I thought it was worth asking in case anyone else had more background.
And they're somewhat synonymous, but
yeah, they get thrown in synonymously when they are very different. Unfortunately, we really are working on that difference now too. So, yeah. Okay. All right. With that, if there's no additional discussion around item number 4, the risk models, we will move into discussion on section 5, which is our barriers and recommendations.
Just to confirm, everyone can see the screen, correct? And they can see it okay? Does it need to be larger, or are we good with the size? Okay.
Okay. So we've kind of been adding to this. We put some on there initially, and we've also been adding some further down. So we'll start with barriers. And so we've had a bunch of conversation around, I know, the lack of agreed upon standards, and then the data availability. I think those are really 2 big topics. And we're probably not going to solve it in this paper, but at least explain that there, really isn't any standards. Does this group want to have some recommended standards or recommend a way or a group maybe to develop those standards? I don't think we're probably should be charged with designing the standards, but at least mentioning that needs to occur and maybe some recommendations that we put in the paper.
the question whether we should.
Yeah, how do you want to do it?
I think that it would be hard for the group to to determine like a standard that everyone should use for everything. But I think one of the recommendations down at the bottom that goes along with the barrier at the top is that if we agreed on a core set of risk factors and a core set of mitigations that matter and a way to determine those, that could be a starting point for like a common language for people for scientific research, for data capture, for modeling, and that at least maybe, even though there might be different opinions about what the actual risk is and what matters the most, and how much the things matter in different situations, that at least knowing what we're all talking about and talking about the same thing is a starting point. So I would say that first set of recommendations gets at the barriers that the first set of barriers. And just keeping in mind that one of the things that we will have presented in the modeling section is the big picture of how modeling and mitigation and data and measurement, risk communications all fit together. So I think then there will be a better context for these recommendations.
That makes sense to me. Anybody else?
I think to Nancy's point, it's critically important that we acknowledge the limitations of this group was probably not in a position to determine what those were, what the core mitigations are, et cetera. But calling out the importance of establishing those baselines so that we know what information we are attempting to collect in order to inform the models and make them far more responsive to mitigations, or the absence of mitigations, and the sword that may cut both ways in that case. And I think that's a critical missing piece in the current state of the art. Certainly that's been and will continue to be a concern with folks who misunderstand the fire hazard severity zone maps, and that it's critically important that we call out how understanding what these mitigations are and how to verify them is a critical first step to set the stage for risk maps that will be responsive to changes in the environment. A wildfire burning in your area fundamentally changes the potential of a high intensity wildfire burning in that same footprint for a period of time. Homes being hardened, et cetera. All of these taken together make for an accurate representation of how fire will actually spread. And one of the current challenges is that in the absence of agreed upon standards, we don't know what information we're collecting to. And I think that really sets the stage for a second acknowledgement that establishing standards that are, if not universal, at least regionally universal, is going to absolutely create challenges when we have a standard for modeling and we have a standard for enforcement. One being based on the votes that you can get for whatever progressive fire code amendments you're attempting to pass in a jurisdiction. The other being what the best science says is necessary to understand how fire will propagate across the landscape. And I think that has to be called out, because the tension between those two is the root of the great challenge we face in this endeavor.
I'm making a thanks, Dave. Okay, anybody else?
Yeah, this is Robert Marshall. So I don't know that we've ever really defined who is the audience for this document. And the reason that I bring it up is because I do wonder about how much time there needs to be dedicated towards kind of explaining in a really basic way scientific literacy and its importance in this particular process. Because I think that depending on how the paper is written, there could be some cherry picking or misuse of data or misuse of what's in there without understanding kind of the underpinnings of kind of what's going on. So just a thought about how do we address that based on who the audience is. And maybe it's as simple as actually defining somewhere in the document who the audience is. So anyway, just a thought on that.
Okay, yeah, thank you. No, that is important as we're putting it together. Obviously, we know the legislature, but again, kind of to your point, there's definitely different levels of understanding, and I think we need to kind of be aiming towards the average of the folks seeing this would have a low level of understanding of risk modeling. And at today's point, you know, it's challenging, and some people are still swapping risk and hazard. So I think we have a unique opportunity here to really explain to the public and the legislature what risk modeling is and what risk is versus hazard.
This is Nancy. I like Robert's suggestion, and there's an edit, you know, right there on page 5, possible stakeholders and use of the paper. I would like to suggest that we move that up to the background section. The original background, it has our purpose, our goals and objectives, our members, and our contents of report. And that would be a pretty nice place, like maybe after that, like the intended audience for the paper and how we think the paper might be used.
You want to move
That
that
page,
section 1?
if people think that's a good idea.
No, I definitely think it is. It's part of that basic understanding. So,
Yeah, I like the idea as well.
yep. Okay.
So while we're at that point, we said legislature or legislators. Who are our other stakeholders that you all think are important?
I think you have local jurisdictions in there. And I really think the public, because the public really has a hard time with what's going on, you know, in the insurance world too, right? They're wanting to know the things they can do, and one of the questions we've had in fire hazard severity zones is that understanding of risk versus hazard. So I think it's a unique opportunity we have to really delineate that and help the public understand.
I agree with all those. I think that's who I would envision. Maybe fire service professionals. I don't know. Do you all think that CAL FIRE, y'all? Do you think of yourselves as being an important stakeholder for this kind of information, or do you feel like it's already well known in your industry?
No, I think it's important because I think we're all going to, regardless of the fire department, get on the same page about the risk factors, right, in the mitigations. I mean, that's with so many different things a local jurisdiction can do with their building codes and stuff like that and their requirements. I think everybody having a good universal understanding is important.
Dory mentioned in the tax file in the chat, sorry, Firewise communities as well.
Firewise, fire safe.
Yep.
Yeah, I was gonna say fire safe as well.
Hope that this paper will set up the next step, either for the legislature to fund it or to try to spark interest in doing this.
436, right, Scott?
Oh, that's 436. Yeah, I just started reading that today.
Yeah. So Assembly Bill 436, if you haven't seen it, take a look at it.
Yeah, it gives it to us.
The next step is in legislation as we speak. So, very interesting. All right. Good discussion on that. What's that?
So I did not put that together.
No.
That was this.
Yeah. Data availability, again, I think it's one of those pieces, how far does this group want to go? I think we understand there's a lot of challenges around that, but do we want to make some solid, maybe recommendations or of what, how it could be done, how it could be collected. There's some stuff down there in the bottom again, on the bullet recommendations, it kind of ties to that. We're talking about, free and available, free for local professionals, input insurance models, some of that open source data piece. But that kind of goes with data availability too.
Yes. Yeah, that's designed for that one, to try to breach that one barrier that we raised up front.
Yep.
Like we're trying to be constructive, I guess, when we identify a barrier. If we have something constructive to say, we say it. We don't exactly say how it's all going to happen and who's going to do it and how it's going to get paid for, but that one step in the right direction would be this.
Right. Yeah. So that third bullet point kind of ties to that piece as well. In the recommendations.
Should we also acknowledge though the limitation, like I'm thinking about utility infrastructure, there's federal standards and laws in place about what actually can be shared open source. I mean, a lot of it's confidential. There may, have to be an acknowledgement of that and a recognition that there needs to be some sort of workaround for those who need to have access, but I don't know that you can build a model here that really will have everything open source.
Right. Yeah, some of it is very much so not open source.
Yeah, there's definitely a lot of challenges that go along with data. The idea that I was thinking might appeal is that as a homeowner, I have access for free to the data on my own house, and then I have some sort of synthesized information for the area around my house, but nothing to allow me to identify any individual neighbor. It's possible that our fire chief could get individual home information for his or her community, but for the most part, personal information would be disguised, but aggregated up in a consistent fashion so that we could say, X% of the homes within, a radius of Y around your house have this level of mitigation or better, or this level of mitigation or worse, so that you've got a sort of sense of what your community fire risk is in addition to your own personal, and to the state of the community mitigation, which affects your fire risk.
Yeah, it actually, exactly what you're saying, Nancy, it speaks to in 436.
Yeah, I'm looking at a cruising bill. I can't possibly be the one that you're talking about. Low riding across the state.
SB. Are you looking at AB or SB?
Look at SB, Senate bill.
I was looking at Assembly bill.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, reading through it and reading through what we've been doing, I'm really glad we are where we're at, because a lot of the things are in that we're working on in this. So I'm like, we are definitely headed down the right direction. So
Good.
Definitely. Okay. Anybody else about data availability? I think Celeste, we want to add limitations to that as a bullet underneath there. Let's see here. No, take it, go back up to, further up on the page. Right there under post-fire reconstruction, add another bullet there.
There or under it directly?
Directly under data availability. And we may move it around somewhere else, but at least have it captured there.
Okay.
Because limitations are important. Anybody else have anything else for that piece and the barriers? Do you have something, Nancy?
Well, I was getting at like home versus community. It's part of limitations.
Okay. The home, yeah.
And then the jurisdictions responsible, especially for any kind of community mitigation like fire breaks, like how to get them all to report. I know CAL FIRE has a database of some sort. I don't know much about it. I know you've mentioned it before, but just, you know, a lot of different cooks in the kitchen as far as mitigation goes, and how it gets, how that information gets captured and where it's captured and how standard the capture is. Does it make its way into the community, the wildfire modelers, et cetera?
Anthony, I see you have your hand up.
Yeah, I was just kind of comment to what Nancy was saying. A lot of those, you know, mitigation programs are very well in the face of the communities when they're being done. They want people to know the work that's being done, how it's being accomplished, where that funding is being used, right? The one thing I would say under a limitation for under these barriers is in some of these more rural communities, from experience, some of these homes and property owners, they're not even, they're not on, you know, the web or anything like that. They don't, they choose not to be. And so being able to share this information with those particular people so that they are, you know, aware of the risk. I'm sure that they know already, not to be ignorant, you know, they're living in these communities. A lot of them understand, but for those that don't, how we get that to them as well. Just something to consider.
Education in general, probably, right? So, so let's add under limitation. We kind of talked about put sensitive data. I think is what we should probably just call it, sensitive data.
Mhm.
Okay, anybody else? Oh, I see hand. Oh, Max has his hand up.
Yeah, I don't know if this is the right place for it, but it occurs to me, I think maybe Nancy, you said home versus community. It's sort of a spatial, I guess, spatial difference, right? The individuals versus the broader community. I was wondering in the sense of time too. And I think this is a little different from the refresh update issue in the next section. But, you know, let's say a certain parcel doesn't have quite as much exposure to fire hazard because there's an orchard or some other, you know, yeah, you hear a lot now about kind of nature-based solutions or green infrastructure or green belts. I'm hearing a lot of interest in that. But you know, that's only a buffer, if you want to call it that, for as long as it's there, right? And there's no guarantee that some of those parks or orchards or what have you are going to be there. So there's some sort of a temporal limitation on how we're doing the exposure of any given home or community to fire. That I don't know. I'm not sure where that belongs, or if others would agree, but something that's a protection right now, even a fuel break, right? Something that's a protection right now may not be there in perpetuity.
Yeah, it's kind of like what Dave brought up, where you have a wildland fire and you have less hazard for a certain number of years, right? And so, again, I'll jump back to 436. It says shall every 3 years. That is a very short time frame, and to your point, Max, it almost is like it may need to be so dynamic that it's refreshed constantly as much as possible. And I think that annually is a huge stretch, but it might be something that's actually that's living. I mean, because your risk could change at the end of, or your hazard could change in June versus July, right? If you had a large fire or a fuel break was put in, right? And so I almost get this sense, which Nancy will probably laugh at, it's like, I don't know how you turn something into being a completely dynamic risk model that's constantly taking in information and reevaluating on a very short term. Is 3 years to me is a really short term.
Yeah.
I think that's why one thing that I think is really helpful is focusing on data, where you're measuring the mitigations and the current state of them, and then not necessarily, well, if somebody wants to take responsibility for, a probabilistic model and rerunning it like super frequently, I think it's expensive, but may or may not be valuable. But definitely, I would think refreshing the current state of mitigation so that anyone who is running models or scores or whatever is starting from the now and not starting from the 3 years ago stale view. So I think the point that's being discussed is not just sensitive data, but like temporal limitations, the need for current refresh. And I think that's especially true with respect to those fire breaks. Like, they might be well known within the community, but they're not necessarily well known outside the community by the insurance companies in another state that you're asking to underwrite the community, and the cap modelers and the reinsurers who are evaluating the risk in the state. And that's what I was trying to get at, is a central place where they can all see what's going on in California and who's really reducing their risk on a almost not real time, but very, very fresh basis.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I think, but Nancy, one additional element, it's not just the fuel breaks and things around the community, it's the presence or absence of hardening of homes, which is certainly more enduring, but also the presence or absence of maintained defensibles is at least an annual update. And I think when taken together, what is there a maintained green belt or fuel break around the community, or in the absence of that, has there been a fire recently around the community? And then does the community have a high percentage of homes with maintained and verified defensible space along the perimeter where the fire potentially will transition? And are those homes also hardened for embercast? And I think that's, when taken together, those are all the elements that would go into understanding a community's risk. And in understanding it also gives the community a pathway to reducing their risk by carrying out and maintaining those mitigations at both the community and at the parcel level.
I agree 100%.
Max, did you have anything else you'd like to add? Your hand was still raised.
Oh, sorry. No. I don't know how you lower your hand. Okay.
I got it. I took care of
Thank
it.
you.
I
Thank
just
you.
wanted to make sure you didn't want to add anything else.
No, thank you though.
Okay, well, that conversation leads pretty well into, obviously, we're already kind of talking about data frequency and updates, around verifications, the need to refresh, that standardization. Anybody, this previous conversation we just had, want to add any other bullet points? I think we can add the temporal limitations in there that you mentioned, right, Nancy? Just kind of put those in that section.
Right. Some things are more time sensitive than others. Like if I have ember vents on my house, I probably still will have them in a year, but that's not the same as a defensible space.
Right, I think there's those mitigations to, like Dave's point, that you do, they're long-standing, and then I think you actually do start weeding yourself down to things that needs to be, updated, that change with, based off the year, right? Or an incident, some type of disturbance versus what you've hardened your home to.
So with respect to all these first few bullets, the under barriers, lack of agreed upon standards, data availability, limitations, and data frequency updates, they're all kind of in the same little group about having the right information where we can get a holistic view of risk. All of those fall under one category, and then everything else it's sort of it's in addition to, also related, of course, but just in addition to some of these others. So how you format all of that in the outline form, I just thought I would suggest we kind of group those first 4 bullets and sub bullets together.
Yeah, because like the HOA is not a subset of data frequency and updates.
Right. See if Celeste can do her magic and get it where we think it all should be.
Yeah, Word in outline form is a difficult beast, especially when you're sharing your screen. I mean, the whole thing is just very fraught. So all of those are correlated down to recommendations at the bottom. So I don't know if you like addressing barriers and recommendations kind of in groups, but everything we've got on the recommendations at the bottom, core set of risk factors and mitigations that matter, core data that needs to be captured, open source data commons, all of those correspond to these first few bullets we've been talking about.
I think that's a really good point. As we start putting this together, does the group think you're better off identifying a barrier and then the recommendations together? Or as we kind of put this outline together so we think about it and group them the right way? Anybody have any thoughts on that? To me, it makes a little bit of sense to do it that way, but I'm just one thought. My brain works that way. So, like if I want to go, oh, here's a barrier. Well, what are the things that I would do to try to, what are the recommendations for that specific barrier? But
I think it makes it cleaner.
yeah, that's just kind of how I read things.
Plus, it'll help people if they're only looking at something specific.
Right, one little piece.
Yep, agreed.
Okay.
We could even put recommendations in a box because they're constructive, like when we end up formatting it. It's always nice to have, like, go to what do you think we should do and put it in a place where wherever it shows up in the text, it'll be in a little box and we'll say, okay, this is one set of recommendations that the group is making. And that way they'll be easier to find even though they're not all in one place.
Okay. So Celeste, we can work offline to try to get these kind of boxed up where they go. Help the outline a little bit.
Okay. But this is what you guys were talking about. So it's more of like, here's your point, here are your subpoints. So data frequency wasn't its own little section. It is all part of this sort of group here, correct?
Yeah, I'd say if there's a, I'm not going to introduce numbers because all you got right now is circles, and if we try to put numbers in, Word is going to go crazy. But we kind of group all these 4 bullets under like one set of barriers, and down at the bottom, the recommendations would mostly, the first 3 recommendations mostly go to that number 1 set of barriers.
Okay.
There's an overarching data, and underneath it, there's 4 sub-bullets, and then multiple sub-bullets.
Yeah, I mean, the format is crazy, but we'll worry about that later. I think for getting all the great ideas out on the paper is the important thing for now.
We'll rework it all. That's why we go over it in the next meeting.
Mm-hmm.
Make sure we got it right. Make sure you got it right. Okay.
So infrequent events, I don't remember exactly what was said around that time, but I do think that the concept that even though it feels to us living in California as though wildfires are happening all the time, the areas at risk in the state are so much larger than what's actually burned under fairly recent conditions, that we can't just look at the data that's happened for the past, I don't know, 5 years or 10 years or 20 years and say, okay, everything that could happen has happened. So we just have to look at, these are all the possible things we have to plan for. I mean, we keep coming up with new situations that for many of us are different than anything we've ever dealt with before and worse. And so the concept, which is probably obvious to people on this call, but maybe not so much to the stakeholders for this paper, is that what's actually happened is just a small subset of what we have to think about. And so the risk is much bigger than what the historical experience would be able to inform us about, which is one of the reasons for models. But just the limits of what historical data can tell us are not obvious to people outside of the fire and insurance industry, I think.
Yeah, I think that's true, because we are having lots of events in places there is no historical event there. Yeah. That's why you have to have a model, because you don't want to burn everything to find out.
Yeah, and I maybe would tie that one together with concerns regarding CAP models, and just this sort of suspicion. Like I would put those 2 together as if we had any recommendations, they probably would go together. And there is a recommendation about improving understanding of catastrophe models. Mm-hmm. Like just making people more model literate, so that they don't think a model means it's all theoretical. It doesn't, none of it can ever happen. It's just a black box. There's models underlying the weather forecast, or when somebody's saying where a hurricane is coming to our country, and for some reason people seem to believe those okay, but then they have a serious issue with the fact that there might be a wildfire model underlying, risk assessment. So how to better articulate what that barrier is, and better make recommendations to address it.
Okay. Hope I can figure out my notes after where things all go here. Keeping up though.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Where should we put that financial thing? Should that be maybe even the financial concerns mitigations down even more, or?
Yeah, I'd say I'd say that maybe up, but there's a whole body of concerns around incentive to mitigate. Like you could have the best models and risk, communication in the world, and some people still will have no desire to do what you want. And I think there's there's some great research out there on what are people's objections to mitigation, and I think there's more that could be said about this. Like, I don't know, it seems like anyone who's a fire chief probably knows what are the objections to mitigations that they're hearing.
So this is having me call out, though, there's barriers to building a good model, and then there's barriers to using what the model says to make changes. I'm hearing what Nancy's talking about is that second.
Yeah.
Perhaps call that out, and I think there's a lot of things actually that go under. The frequency of events also falls under that. I think that's the same thing with earthquake retrofitting, why people don't redo that, because it's their houses, because it's such an infrequent chance of it happening.
Well, that's a good point. Maybe infrequent events should be grouped back with financial concerns. Like, this won't happen to me. It's never happened here.
Yeah, and the HOA, and I mean, I guess I think I'm hearing that there's just these two broad categories, and if we conflate them, it's going to get really confusing.
Sure.
For people.
So, I mean, I'm sure one is a perceived like excessive cost of what needs to be done. There's confusion about what needs to be done and how much is enough. There's a
whose responsibility is it that fire spread you're talking about? It's really the tragedy of the commons, essentially.
Right. I mean, there's the fact that mitigation in one place reduces risk in another place. So who should bite the bullet and who should pay for it?
Right.
Is that anything we want to touch on in this? I'm trying to think about like how the creep of this, but to say, like, if you leave this at the individual level, you're unlikely to ever achieve the goal of the mitigations you need. Do we want to say anything about that in barriers, or?
I do. I mean, and think about, like, it's all PG&E's problem. We don't have to worry about it inside of our community. A feeling of despair, a feeling like no amount is enough because the risk is so high that there's nothing we can do about it. I mean, I don't know what all the things are, but I do think it's good to be as speaking to people's real concerns in this paper as we can, rather than just sort of skipping over them because we don't have good answers.
Yeah, no, I personally tend to agree as well. I think we can go a ways, but it all does get down to you have ownership in your own parcel, right? So
something else that kind of, Robert Marshall, something else that kind of falls into this category, and I don't know if it belongs under financial concern or if it belongs under its own bullet, but regulatory inconsistency is something, if I, as San Mateo Consolidated Fire Department, have a regulation and my regulation is more restrictive than our neighbor, it's more expensive than theoretically in my jurisdiction to pay for the mitigations Whereas another jurisdiction who may not have a regulatory scheme at all isn't going to have any sort of incentive to do anything from a regulatory standpoint.
I think it's its own place, maybe.
So it's almost like there's data standards and then there's code standards, which is where that.
Yeah, and a lot of the, you know, and that's the other, I mean, the interplay between the two, because the data drives what we do on the regulatory side and, you know, how we do that. But then, you know, again, inconsistency. I mean, we see that in just regular implementation of regulatory action, right? That if I enforce it and somebody else doesn't, there's a higher cost for the people in my jurisdiction. Or if somebody else enforces it harsher than I do, there's, you know, even more of a financial disincentive to do it in there. So people will go to other places and build in those locations, and that consistency becomes really important. So,
Robert, to your point, I kind of took some notes up initially on, so if you go a little, well, it's right there at the very top. So you have, well, lack of agreed upon standards, and we have risk factors, mitigation, fire protection.
yeah, that's actually, I think that's a good place for it.
Okay.
You're suggesting adding it as a fourth bullet?
Yeah, we have fire protection there, but yeah, but within that, we could have, like you said, regulatory requirements. So further up, Celeste. No.
Yeah, next one up.
Next one up, under fire protection. Go. Because I think to me, that's what that really, fire protection, you know, what are the standards? I don't look at that as resources. I look at that as, like you just mentioned, regulatory requirements.
Right.
This jurisdiction has these standards and these have something else. So it's
So,
not really.
Esteban also has his hand up right now as well.
Hi,
Esteban?
thank you for, yes, thank you for taking my comment. I think in terms of this conversation and maybe in the limitation section, I think we need to make it very clear to the public, you know, depending on how this model is being created, I mean, it's not going to necessarily be possible for an individual person to say, this is my home, this is my home's exact characteristics, and I'm going to compare it to all my neighbors' characteristics and, you know, deduce what mitigation factors would or would, I mean, there's an issue of granularity here that I'm not sure whether how we're going to be synchronizing that. I feel like some of the discussions and comments are indicating a very granular level, which I'm not so sure that's what I understand is being designed within this model. But if anybody can perhaps comment on that, I would appreciate it.
I can try to take a stab, Jim, if you.
Yeah, go ahead, Nancy.
So thank you. That's a really useful question. I believe that there's likely to come out of this not a model for the state so much as a framework for the state, which is different than building a catastrophe model or a fire risk model, but a framework through which those kinds of models can be integrated better and have less areas where people just get confused. And in order to do that, what we're trying to do is make a home's individual mitigation status through this open source data commons actually available at that granular of a level. Now that's a holy grail and not easy to do, but I think it would be so effective in allowing the catastrophe models to be more to have better fidelity to the current conditions, and it would allow fire-wise communities and fire chiefs to understand what's going on in their communities more and to be able to tell their stories if they've gone out and had grants about what are the current conditions and what are the things that need to be changed. First, how to prioritize. Like, it starts with having data on what's the current conditions and having it be aggregatable. So we are, as you pointed out, jumping back and forth between the concept of modeling and the concept of data. But it starts with data that feeds models. And if we can reduce the barrier of the lack of data, the models will be better and more useful, and people will be, I think, less confused if the models can't see all the work they did. Does that help, Esteban?
Thank you. Yeah, please continue.
Nick?
Thank you. A couple of comments with respect to the to concern for mitigations and also regulatory requirements. So one of the things we hear from homeowners is that if I harden my home, do I get a reduction in my insurance? And is it sufficient for the amount of reduction to make financial sense for me to spend the money on doing the mitigation? I'm just pointing that out as one thing to consider. And then on regulatory requirements, a few things we've noticed that in terms of dealing with climate change, there's an effort to make a significant part of the state be managed for carbon sequestration. And this will leave a significant part of the state in not exactly an entirely natural condition, but pretty close to it. I mean, there's going to be some management there, but it's not as if it's being irrigated or being mitigated for fire risk. They're addressing something else there, but it presents the same sort of, I think, hazard that you have down on there in terms of, I know you have environmental considerations, but for example, endangered species or that sort of thing. And it happens both in the WUI and for urban parks. And to the extent that people are being asked to mitigate impacts on climate change as part of designing a new community, having to plant carbon absorbing materials, plants and vegetation like that, it's potentially creating or increasing to some degree the hazard that would not otherwise be there. I would say that in terms of risk also, and one of the challenges we have with evacuation and ingress and egress is regulations dealing with reducing vehicle miles traveled through measures that increase congestion by narrowing roads and by putting in speed tables and bulb outs in terms of traffic. And those are designed to slow traffic, not evacuate. And I know that the LA Times wrote a piece about that with respect to Paradise. So these are a somewhat scattershot approach to the many different types of obstacles to creating something that is most wildfire resistant. I can speak now directly for our industry. One of the big concerns that we face is that no matter what we do in state law, we wind up getting confronted at the local level through folks who are opposed to our projects in the CEQA process, that whatever we did wasn't good enough. And so I know, I talked to you last time about the idea of can we quantify the amount of risk reduction we get by doing certain things, and I think that part again would be helpful there. But insofar as we're not doing anything that addresses some of these obstacles, it does make it seem to some folks that it's, I don't know, maybe not worth doing. That's not my position, but I'm just saying it makes it harder for people to go, oh, okay, if I do that, then I'm not going to get the opposition that people are using this just as a reason to say no to more housing.
So those seem like really great practical and a perspective that is important and maybe not so obvious when you have well-intentioned requirements that have a benefit in one area, but in this particular area, there's a corresponding price to be paid. So maybe just putting it out there. I mean, this is supposed to, the legislators and local jurisdictions are supposed to be our audience. And if it's pointed out to them that there's a tension between one of the things that they want and something else that they want, maybe it'll make it easier to have the discussions and work out like what's more important, like what's the path forward. I mean, Nick, does that seem like it might be helpful?
Yes, thank you.
Nick, what would you, if you had to give the bullet point a name, what would you call it? You bring up a very interesting conversation, but in order to capture it here, how do we, what would be a bullet point, or how would we word a bullet point?
Well, I'm not sure. I mean, you have regulatory requirements up there towards the top. I guess I'd say that regulatory requirements, you might be thinking there of mitigation measures that address wildfires, but there are regulatory requirements that that actually create obstacles to mitigating wildfire hazards.
Yeah.
Yeah. I have a suggestion about this whole section. The barriers and recommendations, it says for determining wildfire risk, I'd say maybe determining and reducing wildfire risk. So up at the top where we were was in the determining, as someone just pointed out a few minutes ago, that whole section is trying to understand wildfire risk. And that's the whole standards, data, limitations, data frequency, et cetera. And then when we get to actually reducing the wildfire risk, I think this all goes under sort of like environmental and regulatory obstacles. And so we've got environmental considerations, but I don't know if that was meant to be make it easier to mitigate the way that it was written, but I thought it meant that these were things that were obstacles, which perhaps had a good intent and great effects in some areas, but they make it harder to reduce the wildfire risk. So it sounded to me like those are Nick's. That might be a good place for Nick's points to be.
Yeah, I agree with that, where it would go. Yeah.
So I got carbon sequestration requirements, traffic calming versus egress. I didn't know how to. Are those good bullet points, Nick? You know your stuff. I don't.
Yeah, I mean that would certainly remind me, as you're developing this, to give some more detail if you'd like it.
Yeah, I think give us the things, Nick, that we need to look at, or the ones that we can look at, or at least identify. I don't know all these.
I might just add CEQA and insurance.
Wait, what's insurance? How does insurance get to be an obstacle to mitigation?
Well, now I'm saying now, not just from the, well, it's a concern for us, but I mean, I think for homeowners wanting to do, if we want them to harden their homes,
Mhm.
one of their concerns is going to be, I've heard, that do I get a reduction in the premium that I'm paying to
Mhm.
my insurer? So for example, if it cost me $40,000 to um, harden my home, but it's gonna save me $150 a year in insurance, maybe I'm not gonna be motivated much to do that. On the other hand, if you took me from a $1,500 a year cost to an $18,000 a year cost, but just said I could get you back to the 1,500 if you spent $40,000, or hardening your home, then that makes all the sense in the world. And of course, there are numbers in between all that. So
Right. So can I suggest maybe this section is like environmental and regulatory obstacles or something like that.
mhm, mhm.
This whole subsection. I think that the insurance point is a great one to make and put it up higher in not in environmental and regulatory obstacles, but put it in like another objection that people have is a disconnect between the mitigation action and insurance availability and affordability. Um, so it's not only a personal cost benefit thing, which is the example you gave, but there's also a countervailing thing where if your community doesn't get the risk down, nobody gets insurance except for if they all go to the FAIR plan.
Right.
I think you can't get quoted if you want to sell your house. Nobody's going to want to write your policy. That gives a special kind of urgency that it goes even beyond this. How much will it cost me versus what will it save me?
That's right. I totally agree with that.
Which is where we are in a lot of places.
Right.
So I think there's a whole. If we start the first half of this as barriers to determining wildfire risk, and then the second as barriers to reducing wildfire risk, then we've really got like the first four bullets are to determining, and now we're into what keeps people from wanting to reduce their risk, even if we got the risk determined right. What would still be on the table that would make it hard to get people to do what we think they should do. And I think that's still one.
Makes sense.
And I think for that second group, given our task, maybe we're not going to spend a whole lot of time trying to put a bunch of recommendations together on how to resolve that. But I think it's more making the overarching point that just because you build it, they will not, if you build it, they will come. It's not the truth that you could build this whole model and still have not really a whole lot of change happen.
Right.
Was there another hand up or somebody didn't put one down? Or Nick, was that you still talking? I can't tell on this screen.
Esteban, I just wanted to make sure though that the insurance, before we go to Esteban, the insurance portion of it is going to go under the financial concern for mitigations. Is that
could be
consensus?
one. Yeah, we'll figure out how to reorganize. Maybe if you just get it down there, disconnect between mitigation action and insurance availability and affordability.
I'm missing something in there, but
Mitigation, then just delete the word and, or swap it with action. And insurance availability / affordability.
Thank you. Esteban?
Yeah, and maybe if Nancy can provide a little bit of more insight into this last round of discussions. I guess just wanted to make sure that it's going to be clear that the model that's being talked about earlier is not necessarily a financial model. It's not going to, or maybe it is. Is it intended to incorporate some sort of financial analysis modeling in terms of being able to calculate, you know, the benefit or the cost of mitigation versus, you know, any benefits in terms of insurance policies or whatever? It seems like some of those things just need to be maybe a little bit better clarified, that, you know, the model is going to be given the risks, which is informing some of these recommendations, but it's not that maybe just clarify the extent to which the model can or is not suitable for making financial recommendations of kind of what's being talked around here.
Great, great question. I'd say what would be likely to come out of this is not just a model, but a framework through which models that are already in use are better connected to what's actually happening. The insurance system, for example, insurance availability. Well, an insurance company is going to make its decisions based on a lot of different things. And so there's no model that will say company X will quote in Orinda if enough people do this. There's no financial model that can do that. There are ways to calculate for a given company, if they file their rates, like how much the rates would change under certain mitigation situations. But that still isn't something that would happen through a catastrophe model. It's something that would happen through their publicly filed rates. So that's really outside of the scope of this. What we're talking about is the framework through which these insurance companies evaluate risk and how visible the mitigation actions are to the insurance companies. If the actions are visible and they're and they know that they can rely on the data year in and year out for not just one little town that has a lot of money and they can do a data call every year, but all the little towns that are in the WUI that they have to be able to underwrite, they will incorporate this data into their underwriting and pricing. And that, instead of calling it the model, I would call it the framework through which this data makes it into CAP models and into insurance decisions. So I know it's really a complex actuary type answer, but hopefully that helps.
Is that be confusing?
Well, it really just underscores how critical it is to be able to track mitigations when they happen and to be able to track, that temporal of, do they stay in place?
If you don't allow the insurance companies a way to track and verify mitigations, you can't expect them to significantly discount their premiums.
Dave Winokur?
Yeah, I would suggest a slightly more simplistic way of looking at the same issue is to say the goal of a risk model should be to most accurately portray conditions on the ground that will lend itself to wildfire spread. And if we focus on how that is as with regard to the quality of the data, and then a subsequent use of the data is giving people a sense of what steps they would need to take to reduce their risk and how to report those steps. So essentially giving folks agency to improve their condition rather than saying you live in a landscape that is fire prone and you are in a hazard area. We transition to, and these are the mitigations that will reduce that risk. And then the pricing and so forth will all follow naturally through established systems. But I think the biggest takeaway is the importance of a risk model that not only indicates where work should be prioritized, but provides a mechanism to report completion and maintenance of that work over time.
This conversation does help really illustrate how important it is to set the stage up at the beginning, like the use of models and what this paper's about, and what this kind of data could do. So I think, I mean, it's really helpful for me to hear these questions.
Me too. Okay, I think we touched on everyone. Somebody keep me honest here. I've got so many notes and lines going different places to different things that I'm not sure. I don't think we discussed why we have HOA in there at this point. And then we also have property ownership in there. I think that property ownership is basically related to private land, or is it governmental, or somebody that you can't do anything on, or somebody couldn't. I'm not sure why we had that one in there.
Well, that would also be renters versus owners, which is
Renters versus
a
owners
huge
too.
issue with energy
Okay.
efficiency and solar and all of those kinds of things too. In HOA, that an HOA can actually present a barrier to doing mitigations. Or it could present help.
It can be both ways,
It
right?
can be both ways, yep.
It can.
I mean, is an HOA ever not a barrier? But,
You're very optimistic.
Does anybody have any more on those two? I'm trying to review and see where I'm at here. We brought up everything we have on the current list.
I'd be interested if anyone had any recommendations that have to go with the last few things we've been talking about.
Are you specifically talking about the ownership of property and the HOA stuff, or the environmental considerations as well?
Pretty much the barriers to that we're talking about, the barriers to getting people to mitigate, those are some of the ones that we've talked about, and then just the aesthetics issue, like the people who don't want to get rid of their rose bushes or whatever's, concern about home values. I mean, there's a lot of different objections. Maybe more targeted outreach would be a recommendation, like better research about specific objections for specific areas of the state, and targeted outreach that deals with those, with the kinds of things that speak to the communities.
So Nancy, I kind of want to push back a little bit. I really do think that if we try to do recommendations and all these, we're getting way outside of our bandwidth. I think this second set is more important just to call out barriers to the use of it, but our task is more of the model.
Right.
Okay. Well, that's a good point. Thank you. Too ambitious.
Yeah.
I mean, I happily talk about it. It's interesting, but it's just, we're not.
No. We've got enough to chew on here. You're right.
Yeah, keep working on this balance. How far do we go, right? We can write a novel.
Yes. There's a lot you can say on those barriers, for sure.
But I think it's good to at least point them out, right?
Mm-hmm.
And maybe some of them do warrant a recommendation. Once we get them dug out, we can just single those out. I'm like you.
Yeah, actually, we could frame it not so much as here's a bunch of problems, but here's opportunities for future work that the state might want to pick up.
Mm-hmm.
More legislation. Good idea.
Yep.
Jim's next committee assignment.
Yeah, you never know. You never know. Okay, does anybody else, does anybody else have any items to add to the barriers for determining / reducing wildfire risk. I'm getting the heading figured out now.
I know in earlier meetings, we had talked about where does the role of climate change and the changing environment surrounding climate change, kind of where does that go? And I think we had talked a little bit about in barriers, having something there that basically talks about, we kind of don't know what's going to change. And, you know, how often do we need to assess that, or how often does that need to be taken into consideration? I don't know a good place to put it, or even how to word it, but I kind of feel like it really isn't exactly addressed. I think we had talked about it being under environmental considerations, but.
And I have a hard time with this one specifically, because just in the way I kind of look at it is climate change and the things that are happening, whether it's rainfall, to me, those kind of sit on the hazard side, not so much of the risks with mitigations, but then you throw something in like carbon and then it's like, I don't know where it goes, right? So.
Well, predicting your wildfire risk certainly includes the changing environment, you know.
Right, but that's on the hazard side.
Okay, I guess I still don't understand hazard versus.
So what are your fuels? What is your weather?
Yeah.
Those are more of the hazard side than the risk side. So
yeah, but I think there's some predictions that go along with an increase in temperature of a degree has certain effects on the environment. And
right.
And I don't know whether or not there's enough there, like how accurate those predictions are to be able to then incorporate into a model, to be able to say, you know, look, the prediction is in the next 30 years that the temperature is going to rise 1 degree. So how is that going to affect the environment over that period of time? And does the risk model need to look at that from a standpoint of, you know, right now, this is what the risk is, and this is how your risk model is going to address it. But if you're looking at something, you know, like a big development over time that's in a wildland area, how is that going to change it?
Mm-hmm.
So that's kind of where I'm coming from on that.
This is a live issue in the utility world right now as
right.
well. Yeah.
Right.
And that you can't necessarily rely on the past. That's what they've done, is look at the past to try to.
Correct.
Right, which is that's kind of where because when it comes to the actual hazard maps, that's one of the big questions that a lot of us have when we're looking at those hazard maps is, you know, we're being told climate change doesn't factor into what this says right now, which makes sense if CAL FIRE decides to adhere to a regular update of those maps, because then it can go. But like my jurisdiction, you know, I'm in an area that traditionally has had very high amounts of fuel moisture and a lot of moisture in the air, but we know, all of us who live there know that the fog is getting less and less. And while we don't have a fire history there now, in the next 10 years, we probably are, and that's going to change the hazard, right? It seems to me that is at least minorly predictable. Now, how accurate those predictions can be, I don't know, because I don't understand the science well enough. But how, like, should it be addressed in here? Even if it's to say, hey, we didn't address this, or it can't be addressed, I think it's important to at least talk about it.
So Nancy, I'm gonna refer to Nancy here on risk model. Do you know if climate change is in it? I've seen some models that are, to your point, like this area has a high risk of changing its climate, basically, right? I've seen those, but I don't know if it's ever been like incorporated. So Max probably knows too. So Nancy, then I think Max has his hand up. We'll just go down the list.
Sure. I think first that we should include a section on climate models versus CAP models in section 4. And so I've just written a note to do that, because this is a great comment, and it points out a pretty big oversight in when we talked about section 4. So the answer to the question is certainly it depends. Most historical catastrophe models that are in use for just talking about pricing insurance are trying to capture current conditions. They are trying to capture how much climate has influenced current conditions, but they have to do something extra to do that, and they have to do something more extra to forecast into the future what additional things might change as climate further alters the wildfire risk. So certainly the models are the starting point. Climate models may be very good at macro trends of wildfire risk, but they typically can't get anywhere near down to the level of understanding current risk and how people could mitigate it. And so they're not very useful for that. And so it's like putting a telescope and a microscope next to each other and going, how do we connect these things together? They're both looking very hard at something, but maybe in different ways. And so there are certainly lots of new models that are being built to do both of these things.
Thank you, Max.
Yeah, that's super interesting, Nancy, the microscope telescope analogy. So my lab has spent a fair amount of time developing future projections, and I guess one of the things I would ask is, instead of climate versus cat models, are we thinking of, or is another way of slicing it, historical versus future? Because if you're training some model to predict an outcome based on historical observations, you have some data that help you train the model and then test the model to see if your outcomes make sense. Whether it's probabilistic or deterministic or whatever, that's sort of a general model building flow. But one of the things that we've found in projecting fire activity forward in the future is it depends. It can hinge so strongly on which climate future you actually use to drive the model. And there's dozens, right? To be really blunt about it, there's warm, wet futures versus warm, dry futures in different parts of the state. And they have really different future fire probability and probably fire severity implications. So it really depends on which future you use in the climate forecast, a warm, wet versus warm, dry, just being the simplest way of thinking about it. The other thing that has been coming to light is that it's not just climate, it's also building patterns in the future. Actually, development patterns in many parts of the state have just as strong a signal on future fire probabilities as the climate variables do. Right? There's kind of a hump-shaped response of fire activity to human development. There's a very generic pattern there. So if you're going to project into the future, you got to decide which climate future you want to drive the system with, and you got to decide which land use and development scenario you want to use to drive the system forward on, because both of them have really strong influences on future fire patterns. So anyway, that's just a long-winded way of saying it really depends when you're going to push things forward, what you're going to use as your drivers, which scenarios are you going to use?
Anthony also has a comment. Anthony?
Hi. Hey, you guys hear me okay?
Yeah.
Okay. As much as I appreciate the climate discussion, it is when we look at fire behavior, the weather is the most fluctuating contributing factor to fire behavior and fire spread, right? So when you open up that can of worms of climate, I think that we're getting even further into the weeds. Yes, climate change and significant fire weather, do they live in the same lane? I don't think so. I think that climate change is his own battle, is his own discussion. I think that when we look at like the fire danger level, as far as like that gets put out nationally and by the state, when that danger level goes up, so does the risk, right? And I think that as long as we're focusing on the geographic locations of these communities and parcels that are impacted in a wildland fire community, right? Because that doesn't change, the landscape doesn't change, the fuels fluctuate, and there's a time lag to fuel moisture based on that weather. But we all know that, some of these communities are getting impacted in the middle of February, the middle of March. I've been on fires where there's been snowstorms and there's still fire ripping through communities based on the fuel type and wind that's driving it, right? So climate change, yes, I think that's a different avenue that if we dive into, it's too much crystal ball with all that on the long-term effects. I think we focus on the geographic areas, the topographic features, the fuels that are based in those areas, and then as that fluctuation of fire danger level goes up and down based on those geographic locations on weather, moisture, and all these different things that lower the significant fire behavior, so does the risk fluctuate along with it. I've kind of just been listening to a lot of these, earlier in the conversation, there was a lot of talk about how do we maintain currency in 3 years, 1 year. It's something that's got to be fluid, right? But on an annual basis, yeah, that's a hard ask. But if there is a fire that comes and changes the landscape and fuels and risk potential, then that should be something that's looked at by those local geographic areas, and then they can go to the table, meet, confer, and come up with solutions based on how they want to tackle that, just built into the guide.
Okay, thank you. Okay, any other pieces that we want to put up for notes for section 5? Okay, we will completely reorganize this to go over at the next meeting. So Celeste and I have our work cut out for us. Okay, no other comments. If you have some, just throw them out there. But roundtable, anybody have anything they'd like to add for the good of the group or the project? Thank you, Celeste.
Can we talk about how we get, can we refresh our memory of what our future dates are?
Yeah.
Like our upcoming meeting dates?
Well,
or our
writing.
Okay.
And reviewing. Is this the proper time to talk about that?
Sure it is. Celeste, do you have that? I don't have it with me.
Do you remember when our draft was due and work backwards from there?
So we were going to try, Celeste, correct me if I'm wrong, have it to the WMAC group in May. Yeah, May, and then we would do final revisions in June, if I remember right.
That is correct. I'm looking to see if I can find the outline that we drafted many, many months ago. Okay, I have a rough draft here of what was discussed at one meeting sometime in November, maybe, yeah, November it looks like. That we would start drafting, draft reviewing report between February through April. And we would have a draft to the WMAC by May.
Yep, I think I remember that. That looks correct to me.
So would it be appropriate to find people to lead the drafting?
Yep, section. So we can do that a couple ways. I could send out a list to the group about the sections. We have some people assigned to some of them already. But I do want folks to remember this, that there cannot be more than 3 people. Is that right, Celeste? 3? Not more than 3 people for each topic to work on, because
Yeah.
then we have to have a meeting. That to
Yeah,
be
so-
a agendized meeting.
Yes, so no more than 3 committee members. However, the caveat there is that if you have, so Nancy, I'm just going to use you as an example because you're here. So you're allowed to bring in people from your team, no problem, that can participate. And then plus other 2 committee members, and they can bring in people from their team as well. So you can bring in as many people. There just can't be those that sit on the committee. On the committee, there cannot be more than 3 of you meeting at one time.
Great, good to know. So then we've got background and then 4 sections. Sections 2 through 5, which are the lion's share of the work.
Yep.
You would pick one like leader for each of those, and then up to 2 additional committee members working on it. And it does sound like maybe if you did a survey that just had each section, like, and maybe just figure out who's even interested,
Yep.
so that you can collate that information and then maybe make some decisions about twisting some arms and shifting people around, and finding the right balance of people for each section so that they're all going concurrently.
Okay, yeah, I think that's exactly right. We'll work on that. So thank you. We'll figure out how to build that. Get input from the group. Probably see something this week or next week, the latest.
Okay. And then we'll have to, I mean, we're trying to make this fairly short, right? Like, we're thinking 5 pages a section, or is it too hard to even put numbers down?
So I think it's hard for me, but I don't, some of them are definitely, like we talked about today, fairly big, so.
So do we want to just do an overarching, like a goal of 50 pages is the max, or, and shoot for,
That'd be 10 per thing plus, so less, so 8, that'd be, yeah,
maybe shoot for 40 and allow for 50?
Sure,
So
Yeah.
8 pages a section?
yeah.
Max,
most, I would
yeah,
think,
but I think some will need more and some will need less.
Yeah.
But yeah, I agree, let's just make this as streamlined as possible, or else nobody will read it.
Yeah. And I mean, there's going to have to I don't know if you want to have an executive summary at the front or just run through the whole thing. Like a lot of times there's a table of definitions and acronyms, or I mean, it can get big really fast. And so the longer this thing is, the harder it's going to be to edit it and go through the review process.
Yeah.
I think the executive summary is all that most legislators will ever read.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I
Right.
think
Yeah.
But we don't have, how about background and executive summary? Because we don't have an executive summary in there right now.
I think so. I think they kind of put them together.
So then you'll need somebody to volunteer for that section too. And you won't be able to write the executive summary probably till
The end.
you're pretty far down the road.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, another hard question. How long is the longest we can have before we have to start circulating drafts? Like, in like 6 weeks, 5 weeks, something like that?
I think that's probably right. If we need to get it to the WMAC, we can have it on the agenda. But if we get it to them in May for their May meeting, we can introduce it to them in May and get comments back. It'll be kind of tight on them, but that's kind of where we are with the July. I mean, we don't have a lot of choice. So.
Nope. So if we did the first drafts by mid-April for each section,
Yeah.
then that would give 1 month for putting the whole thing together and group review.
Yeah.
And that gets us to mid-May.
Yeah. Yeah, their meeting's the third week, so that would work.
And maybe, maybe they could get an early draft if there's just a few of them that you want to incorporate in the review process. I don't know if that's a doable thing, but if there's some people that are more interested than others, they can get an early view and it can seem less onerous to review a 40-page doc.
Yeah.
But editing a big doc that's written by a bunch of different people, it's non-trivial. Making it just look and sound the same and have definitions carry through and all that, it's a lot of work. Even formatting,
Okay. Well, we will work on that and work on getting the template with format or something. I think Celeste has most of it already. That way it starts out in the right direction. So.
Okay. So in our next meeting, is there anything in particular we need to accomplish?
Well, we'll redo and go over section 5, and just so we can go over that outline, and then I'll work on getting things assigned to folks. We'll get that put out, and then should be able to. It's already March. It's going to be March, right? March. So we'll need to be well into doing some of the writing. Maybe just do updates from the leads of each section at that point. So we'll work on getting this out very quickly.
That sounds good. We can do desperate calls for help as needed.
Yeah,
or a proud demonstration of our progress if that's the way that things progress.
Maybe a little of each, right?
Hopefully I'd be in camp number 2.
Yeah.
I also wanted to just ask for the CoreLogic wildfire model. There's a separate sort of demo / presentation where they're talking about their hazard model and their wildfire score, just as kind of an illustration of how a commercial cap model vendor approaches these things. Does anybody have any specific questions you want that presentation to address? Because they want to be useful and give good information to the group. This is not a commercial. It's only to be a useful avenue to give information. So anyone who has questions that you want answered, I'm gonna go over their presentation with them before I guess it's Friday.
Yeah, right. I don't have any specifics myself.
Okay. Anybody else want to just put questions in the chat, like everything you ever wanted to know about models but were afraid to ask? Okay, if you think of
You
it.
can also, oh, go ahead. Sorry, Nancy. They can also, if you have questions that come up after this meeting and you want to send them to me, what would be the date that you would need them by? Wednesday, tomorrow? What do you think, Nancy? So I can get them to
I'll be
you.
talking to them on Thursday. I mean, they'll be able to retool for specific questions. So Wednesday or Thursday's fine.
Yeah. So if you guys want to send any questions to me, I'm happy to filter them over to Nancy and over to the presenters as well.
Thank you.
Okay. Anybody else? All right. Is there any public comment? No, Celeste? Okay. Very good. Upcoming meeting will be March 20th, but again, this Friday we have a webinar with CoreLogic. And with that, I will go ahead and ask for a motion to adjourn the meeting.
So moved.
Hey, is there a second?
Second.
Okay. Moved and seconded. All in favor of adjourning the meeting? Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Very good. You got 2.5 minutes of your day back. That's pretty good. So appreciate all the conversation. This has really been good. We will work on this and be looking for some emails this week and thinking about which sections you'd like to assist on. Because as we mentioned, with about 60 days-ish to get this thing put together in a good solid draft. So that's kind of where we're at. So with that, thank you for your time today and for some emails. Appreciate it.
Bye, guys.
Thank you.